This video will dive into the love of the name Caroline by Branwell Brontë and his sister Charlotte Brontë. This was first noticed by Daphne du Maurier in her 1960 biography, The Infernal World of Branwell Brontë. She writes, "The name Caroline was something of an obsession, conscious or unconscious, with both Branwell and Charlotte. Caroline Vernon was the name of one of Branwell's characters in his writings. Caroline Helston was one of the two heroines in Charlotte's novel Shirley, and a dead Caroline is mourned in yet another of Branwell's poems, The Wanderer." Poetically, the reason for the obsession could be the rhythmic quality of the name itself. It rhymed very suitably with decline, which is used in the poetry. And the name was, while not common in 1840, it does not reach the top 15 names list in England. It was a well-known name. There was a friend of Branwell's, William Dearden, and he knew Branwell in the 1830s, and when Dearden was teaching at Keighley Grammar School, Dearden's cousin died of typhus fever 10 years before, and Dearden would have told Branwell about this, and so maybe the name Caroline being associated with death inspired Branwell. It's also interesting because Branwell's own dead sisters, Elizabeth and Maurier, had no names as middle names or their own first names being Caroline. I have a theory that I will present in this video that the name Caroline was beloved by the Brontës because of a society figure at the time, Lady Caroline Lamb. Lady Caroline Lamb would have been known to the Brontës because she was written about by various publications, and she was very well known due to gossip around her activities. She embarked on a scandalous affair with Lord Byron when she was 26 and he was 24 in 1812. And before that, Lady Caroline Lamb was a member of the nobility. She was the only daughter of the second Earl of Bessborough. She was known as the Honorable Caroline Ponsonby until her father succeeded to the earldom in 1783. She traveled around Europe, including in Italy, in her childhood, and at the age of 19, she married the Honorable William Lamb, an up-and-coming politician and the heir to the first Viscount Melbourne. He would later become the Prime Minister under Queen Victoria, but at the time it was a love match, and they were mutually captivated during a visit to Brocket Hall in 1802 with each other. So Caroline Lamb was known in the society papers, and as late as 1875, even the American newspapers, such as the New York Times, were reporting on the life and times of Caroline Lamb. Would the Brontës have known of Lady Caroline Lamb? I think so, due to her connection to Lord Byron. The magazine Blackwoods was beloved by Branwell, and he wrote to it throughout his life asking to be published. He also created his own mini magazine, which he called Branwell's Blackwoods Magazine. So the Brontë family read Blackwoods regularly. Blackwoods was a staunch admirer of Lord Byron in the beginning of his career, but when he published Beppo, it damned him in a June 1818 review as a hypocrite and a reveller. And thereafter, the magazine moved between celebrating Byron for his genius and castigating him for his perversion of it. Byron objected to the uneven treatment he received at the hands of the Blackwoods critics, but in some observations upon an article in Blackwood's Edinburgh magazine, he echoed their views on several contemporary poets and seemed to reconcile himself to the exuberant unpredictability of the magazine. Beppo was written by Lord Byron in 1817 before his mother died, and he wrote it in an Italian ottava rima meter, which emphasizes satire. And so this was a poem that was a precursor to his best-known poem, Don Juan, and the poem compares English and Italian morals, arguing that the English aversion to adultery is hypocrisy, and that adultery is something that happens all the time, and there are customs of people known as cavalier serventes in Italy who cheat on their spouses, and it's just a part of society. And so the poem used satire at jabs for couples, and it also jabbed at literate women and other poets, including Robert Southey, who Byron renamed Botherby. And so this was a poem that Blackwood spent some time on, and it's likely that Branwell and Charlotte would have read this review by Blackwood's and become familiar with Lord Byron when very young. They remembered that their aunt, Elizabeth Branwell, would subscribe to magazines in addition to Blackwood's, and they would read these magazines cover to cover. Charlotte Brontë wrote years later that she would read magazines by stealth and with the most exquisite pleasure. So reading things that might not have been suitable for children was common in the Brontë household, and then you add the fact that Byron was responding publicly to his critics in Blackwood's, and so you have this society where the Brontës would have been reading all of this. Branwell loved Blackwood's magazine, so the fact that it turned its back in a way on Byron would have impacted Branwell. Regardless, we know Branwell wrote Lord Byron's other works. In January 1847, Branwell wrote a letter to his sculptor friend J.B. Leland, quoting from Lord Byron's epic poem Don Juan, which was published between 1819 and 1824. This was the first time Branwell was quoting Don Juan. Usually he quoted Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, which was published from 1812 to 1818, and Manfred. And so it's thought that he was quoting from Don Juan because he was identifying more with Lord Byron's more perverse work. And at the time, Brontë was publicly suffering due to his alcoholism and his laudanum addiction, which you can listen to on my channel in a different video. And Branwell was struggling to come to terms with his consistent romantic disappointment from his employer's wife, Mrs. Robinson, as well as his heavy drinking in the Black Bull in Haworth and pubs around Halifax. Byron was not an opium addict, unlike other romantic poets. If you read Byron's Childe Harold, for example, it's about sex and sex with different people, including little boys. And so Byron's perversion was way more sexual than drug-induced. Not to say he didn't try opium, he probably did, but opium was the realm of Thomas de Quincey, Coleridge, and more of Percy Shelley, who was one of Byron's closest friends. So it's interesting that Branwell found himself diving into Byron's works to express how he was feeling during his depths of alcoholism and opium addiction via laudanum. Starting in 1812, Lady Caroline Lamb and Lord Byron's obsession with each other was making its way into publications. Byron referred to Lamb by the nickname Caro, which she adopted as her public nickname, and so this may have been published and come to the attention of the Brontës. After Byron broke things off, Lady Caroline Lamb was incredibly depressed, and her husband took her to Ireland. This distance did not cool her interest in Byron, and they exchanged letters constantly. It really was obsessive on both sides. Right now, there's this scholarship that it was Lady Caroline Lamb who was this crazy ex-girlfriend, and while she did do some crazy things, she threw a glass when she saw Lord Byron talking to another woman at a party. She sent him clippings of her pubic hair with a letter that she cut too close and she drew blood. He did similar things. He sent her locks of his hair. He had no problem, being with her in her home, waiting for her husband to arrive. He was publicly with her, would take her to different events, would write about her to his friends, to his publisher. So this idea that Caroline Lamb was this crazy person and operating on nothing is just not upheld when you look at the literature. Both of them would write poetry in the style of each other, and when Lady Caroline returned to London in 1813, Byron made it clear he had no intention of restarting their relationship, and he went on to marry her cousin. And he remained close to her mother, and they would exchange letters. So again, we see this sort of mixed signals coming from Byron. Lady Caroline's obsession with Byron would define a lot of her artistic life. She did have a son, and she was dedicated to his care because he was mentally disabled, but she would write to people pretending to be Byron, and she could mimic his style significantly that she actually got one of his paintings by pretending to be him, and she would publish poetry, and he would publish poetry. For example, he wrote a poem about her: remember thee, till left quench life's burning stream. Remorse and shame shall cling to thee, and haunt thee like a feverish dream. Remember thee, I doubt it not, thy husband too shall think of thee. By neither shalt thou be forgot, thou false to him, thou fiend to me. In 1816, Lady Caroline Lamb published Glenarvon, which was a huge sensation. It was set in the Irish Rebellion of 1798, and it satirized British society. It cast a skeptical eye on left-wing politics. It had a title character, Lord Glenarvon, but the heroine is Calantha, who is Caroline herself. And she also peppers the book with not so flattering descriptions of her friends and people she knew. It caused such an outburst that Lady Jersey took her revenge by barring Caroline from Almack's, which was a social center for the nobility and fashionable people. And so you see Lord Byron's comments about adultery sort of coming true, that there's this huge hypocrisy with it when it came to the British upper classes, and that they accepted her when she was cheating on her husband with Lord Byron, but now that she published a book about it, she was banned from Almack's and other clubs. The book was written while Caroline was in the throes of alcoholism. She became an alcoholic, and it was very difficult, these descriptions of her later in life where she's walking around her apartment looking for something to drink. But if you read the book, it's clear that her mind wasn't in the best spot. The main character has a little brother who dies in one part of the book, and then later on he's brought back to life and he's alive. And so it's very confusing to read, but it's clear that she wanted it to be a poke at people in her life, including Lord Byron. And while she fictionalized the Byronic persona and made fun of it and made fun of its melodrama and its martyr ability, she gave voice to female characters that remained silent in Byron's early work. And Byron read Glenarvon, and he responded to it. And he responded to this female perspective by creating a feminized hero based on Caroline Lamb and strong speaking roles for women in his later chapters of Don Juan. And he did this because he said his purpose was to undermine and not uphold feminine power. But this dialogue between the two writers, previously lovers, would have been known to the Brontes, and they would have just devoured this, because all of British society was reading both authors and commenting on their relationship and also the qualities of the works. And so while Don Juan is what's remembered today, Glenarvon is also an important work to understanding the Byronic hero and British society at the time. So what did the Brontes think of all this? Well, Charlotte actually put a quote from the Corsair, published in 1814, in Jane Eyre, which was published decades later. So it's possible that they read the entire Glenarvon Don Juan deal, but just decided not to put pieces or quotes from Glenarvon in their works. The Corsair was extremely popular and sold 10,000 copies on its first day of sale. It was influential in art. Here you can see Eugene Delacroix's 1831 painting episode from the Corsair. It also inspired ballet. The plot was based on a pirate, and he wanted to attack a pasha and seize all of his possessions. His wife, Medora, wants to convince him to abandon his plan and not embark on the mission. And the plot was set in the Aegean Sea. The empowerment of the heroine in the Corsair is important because it is Medora who kills the pasha herself. And then Conrad learns that she dies from grief, believing that he himself, the main character Conrad, had died. And the closing line is, "He left a Corsair's name to other times, linked with one virtue and 1,000 crimes." This resonated with Charlotte, and we can sort of see the similarities with the empowerment of the female character superseding the male character, where Jane Eyre, who's this governess, becomes a greater figure than Lord Rochester, who's a member of the nobility. There are also themes in Jane Eyre of salvation. And so in some of the closing scenes, spoiler alert, if you haven't read Jane Eyre, which has been published since the 1800s, that Jane Eyre is this salvation force to Mr. Rochester, and when he's blinded after a fire, she comes and she brings a light and combs his hair and gives him dinner. And so you sort of have this theme of woman as salvation in the two stories. Switching gears to another potential source of the name Caroline is Jane Austen. And when someone told Charlotte Brontë she should write more like Austen, she replied, "Whenever I do write another book, I think I will have nothing of what you call melodrama. I think so, but I am not sure. I think, too, I will endeavor to follow the counsel which shines out of Miss Austen's mild eyes, to finish more and be more subdued, but neither am I sure of that. When authors write best, or at least when they write most fluently, an influence seems to waken in them which becomes their master, which will have its way, putting out of view all behests but its own, dictating certain words and insisting on their being used, whether vehement or measured in their nature, new molding characters, giving unthought of turns to incidents, rejecting carefully elaborated old ideas, and suddenly creating and adopting new ones. Is it not so? And should we try to counteract this influence? Can we indeed counteract it?" This was not Charlotte's only reaction to Jane Austen. In 1850, she was writing to her editor, William Smith Williams, about the book Emma, and she praised Austen's ability to sketch the lives of the English gentry. Charlotte said, "She does her business of delineating the surface of the lives of genteel English people curiously well. Yet Austen failed to understand people's passions, Brontë argued, saying her business is not half so much with the human heart as with the human eyes, mouths, hands, and feet. What sees keenly speaks aptly, moves flexibly. It suits her to study, but what throbs fast and full, though hidden, what the blood rushes through, what is the unseen seat of life and the sentient target of death. This Miss Austen ignores. She no more with her mind's eye beholds the heart of her race than each man with bodily vision sees the heart in his heaving breast. Jane Austen was a complete and most sensible lady, but a very incomplete and rather insensible, not senseless, woman. These have been construed as harsh words, and publications today, such as the Daily Beast, put the two women against each other. I don't think that's accurate. Brontë and Austen grew up very, very differently. Austen grew up in the pleasant, lovely Somerset. Brontë grew up on the moors of Yorkshire. While both had reverend fathers, their upbringings were very different, both in terms of the poverty of the Brontës to the expectations of both women. Regardless, we know that Brontë was reading Jane Austen, and in Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, one of the characters is named Caroline, and this is Caroline Bingley. And so it's interesting that this is a character that Charlotte would have been aware of, and potentially Branwell would have been aware of too, because the two were so close and read so much of the same things. So Caroline Bingley, being a member of the upper gentry, being someone who's a little bit sharper than the other characters, a little meaner than the other characters, may have been one of the better characters, according to Brontë, based on her reading of Austen. Despite this, I do think that it was Caroline Lamb that made the greater impact on the Brontës, and so I think that the name of Caroline, because it was such an important name to Branwell and Charlotte, I do think that they would have been excited by and interested in the life of Lady Caroline Lamb.